Hi, I'm Jenny, and today I'm going to talk about the book Mark Twain Roughing It. I just read this the last few weeks and I wanted to go over it. It's Mark Twain's, it's based on, I think, 7 years of Mark Twain's life where he took a trip across the United States. He started in St. Louis and he took a train to Kansas City where he got took a overland stagecoach west, and it's pretty funny. There's a lot of humor in it. Some of his humor's really not. It doesn't translate to today. It's pretty cringe, but um, he has some really interesting parts in here where he talks about he talks about the Overland stagecoach drivers and their statuses. And basically, the Overland stagecoach drivers back in the 1800s were. So, this trip started before the Civil War, and the Overland stagecoach drivers back in the 1800s were kind of like pilots of today. They were very well respected, they outranked anyone else that worked in supporting roles at the stagecoach, and everybody really wanted to be them as far as the people at the train at the stagecoach stations. Um, and this is a good excerpt that describes the stagecoach driver. The stagecoach driver was a hero, a great and shining dignitary, the world's favorite son, the envy of the people, the observed of the nations. When they spoke to him, they received his insolent silence meekly, and as being the natural and proper conduct of so great a man. When he opened his lips, they all hung on his words with admiration. He never honored a particular individual with a remark, but addressed it with a broad generality to the horses, the stables, the surrounding country, and the human underlings. When he discharged a facetious, insulting personality at a hostler, that hostler was happy for the day. When he uttered his one jest, old as the hills, coarse, profane, witless, and inflicted on the same audience in the same language, every time his coach drove up there, the varlets roared and slapped their thighs and swore it was the best thing they'd ever heard in all their lives. And how they would fly around when he wanted a basin of water, a gourd of the same for a light for his pipe. But they would instantly insult a passenger if he so far forgot himself as to crave a favor at their hands. They could do that sort of insolence as well as the driver they copied it from. For let it be borne in his mind, the overland driver had but little less contempt for his passengers than he had for his hostlers. So that's kind of, I guess, a little bit of a parallel to the airline industry today. Uh, he describes when they stopped at a station and they would be like worn out from the road and hungry and thirsty. And this describes like their meal. The table was a greasy board on stilts, and the tablecloth and napkins had not come, and they were not looking for them either. A battered tin platter, a knife and fork, a tin pint cup were at each man's place, and the driver had a queensware saucer that had seen better days. Of course, this duke sat at the head of the table. There was one isolated piece of table furniture that bore about it a touching air of grandeur and misfortune. This was the caster. It was German silver and crippled and rusty, but it was so preposterously out of place there that it was suggestive of a tattered, exiled king among barbarians, and the majesty of its native position compelled respect even in its degradation. There was only one cruet left, and that was stopperless, fly-specked, broken-necked thing with 2 inches of vinegar in it, and a dozen preserved flies with their heels up and looking sorry that they invested there. The station keeper upended a disc of last week's bread of the shape and size of an old-time cheese and carved some slabs from it, which were as good as Nicholson pavement and tenderer. He sliced off a piece of bacon for each man, but only the experienced old hands made out to eat it, for it was condemned army bacon, which the United States would not feed to its soldiers in the forts, and the stage company had bought it cheap for the sustenance of their passengers and employees. We may have found this condemned army bacon further out in the plains than the section I am locating it in, but we found it. There is no gainsaying that. Then he poured for us a beverage which he called slumgullion, and it's hard to think that he had not inspired when, and it's hard to think that he was not inspired when he named it. It really pretended to be tea, but there was too much dish rag and sand and old bacon rind in it to deceive the intelligent traveler. He had no sugar and no milk, not even a spoon to stir the ingredients with. We could not eat the bread or the meat, nor drink the slumgullion, and when I looked at that melancholy vinegar crut, I thought of the anecdote, a very, very old one even that day, of the traveler who sat down to a table which had nothing on it but a mackerel and a pot of mustard. He asked the landlord if this was all, and the landlord said, "All? Why, thunder and lightning, I should think there was mackerel enough for 6. But I don't like mackerel." "Oh, then help yourself to the mustard." So that was kind of how their travels were, as far as any conveniences they had. And he described some of the things that they saw during their trip. And I really liked his description of the coyote. "Even at this day, it thrills me through and through to think of the life, the gladness, and the wild sense of freedom that used to make the blood dance in my veins on those fine overland mornings. Along about an hour after breakfast, we saw the first prairie dog villages, the first antelope, and the first wolf. If I remember rightly, this latter was the regular coyote of the farther deserts, and if it was, he was not a pretty creature or respectable either, for I got well acquainted with this race afterward and can speak with confidence. The coyote is a long, slim, sick, and sorry-looking skeleton with a gray wolf skin stretched over it, a tolerably bushy tail that forever sags down with a despairing expression of forsakenness and misery, a furtive and evil eye, and a long, sharp face, with slightly lifted lip and exposed teeth. He has a general slinking expression all over. The coyote is a living, breathing allegory of want." That's Kaya. She likes Dr. Pepper lids. He is always hungry. He is always poor, out of luck, and friendless. The meanest creatures despise him, and even the fleas would desert him for a velocipede. He is so spiritless and cowardly that even while his exposed teeth are pretending a threat, the rest of his face is apologizing for it. And he is so homely, so scrawny and ribby and coarse-haired and pitiful. When he sees you, he lifts his lip and lets a flash of his teeth out, and then turns a little out of the course he was pursuing, depresses his head a bit, and strikes a long, soft-footed trot through the sagebrush, glancing over his shoulder at you from time to time, till he's about out of easy pistol range, and then he stops and takes a deliberate survey of you. He will trot 50 yards and stop again, another 50 and stop again, and finally the gray of his gliding body blends with the gray of the sagebrush, and he disappears. All this is when you make no demonstration against him, But if you do, he develops a livelier interest in his journey and instantly electrifies his heels and puts such a deal of real estate between himself and your weapon. By the time you have raised the hammer, you see that you need a mini rifle, and by the time you have got him in line, you need a rifled cannon, and by the time you have drawn a bead on him, you see well enough that nothing but an unusually long-winded streak of lightning could reach him where he is now. But if you start a swift-footed dog after him, you will enjoy it ever so much, especially if it is a dog that has a good opinion of himself and has been brought up to think he knows something about speed. The coyote will go swinging gently off on that deceitful trot of his, and every little while he will smile a fraudful smile over his shoulder that will fill that dog entirely full of encouragement and worldly ambition, and make him lay his head still lower to the ground, and stretch his neck further to the front, and pant more fiercely, and stick his tail out straighter behind, and move his furious legs with a yet wilder frenzy, and leave a broader and higher and denser cloud of desert sand smoking behind, and marking his long wake across the level plain. And all this time the dog is only a short 20 feet behind the coyote, and to save the soul of him, he cannot understand why it is that he cannot get perceptibly closer. And he begins to get aggravated, and it makes him madder and madder to see how gently the coyote glides along and never pants or sweats or ceases to smile, and he grows still more and more incensed to see how shamefully he has been taken in by an entire stranger, and what an ignoble swindle that long, calm, soft-footed trot is. The next he notices that he's getting fagged, and that the coyote actually has to slacken speed a little to keep from running away from him. And then that town dog is mad in earnest, and he begins to strain and weep and swear and paw the sand higher than ever, and reach for the coyote with a concentrated and desperate energy. This spurt finds him 6 feet behind the gliding enemy and 2 miles from his friends. And then, in that instant, that a wild new hope is lighting up his face, the coyote turns and smiles blandly upon him once more, and with a something about it which seems to say, "Well, I shall have to tear myself away from you, bub. Business is business, and it will not do for me to be fooling along this way all day." And forthwith there is a rushing sound, and the sudden splitting of a long crack through the atmosphere, and behold, that dog is solitary and alone in the midst of a vast solitude. It makes his head swim. He stops and looks all around, climbs the nearest sand mound and gazes into the distance, shakes his head reflectively, and then, without a word, he turns and jogs along back to his train and takes up a humble position under the hindmost wagon, and feels unspeakably mean, and looks ashamed, and hangs his tail at half-mast for a week, and for as much as a year after that. Whenever there is a hue and cry after a coyote, that dog will merely glance in the direction without emotion, and apparently observe to himself, "I believe I do not wish any of that pie." So next, after the coyote section, he's just talking about their trip in the stagecoach across the plains, and how they put their suitcases and everything and made like a flat bed in the stagecoach, and they slept a lot. But here he talks about the Pony Express riders. In a little while, all interest was taken up in stretching our necks and watching for the pony rider, the fleet messenger who sped across the continent from St. Joe to Sacramento, carrying letters 1,900 miles in 8 days. Think of that for a perishable horse and a human flesh and blood to do. The pony rider was usually a little bit of a man, brimful of spirit and endurance. No matter what time of day or night his watch came on, and no matter whether it was winter, summer, raining, snowing, hailing, sleeting, or whether his beat was a level straight road or a crazy trail over mountain crags and precipices, or whether it led through peaceful regions or regions that swarmed with hostile Indians, he must be always ready to leap into the saddle and be off like the wind. There was no idling time for a pony rider on duty. He rode 50 miles without stopping, by daylight, moonlight, starlight, or through the blackness of darkness, just as it happened. He rode a splendid horse that was born for a racer and fed and lodged like a gentleman, kept him at his utmost speed for 10 miles, and then, as he came crashing up to the station where stood two men holding fast a fresh, impatient steed, the transfer of rider and mailbag was made in the twinkling of an eye, and away flew the eager pair and were out of sight before the spectator could get hardly the ghost of a look. Both rider and horse went flying light. The rider's dress was thin, of fitted clothes. He wore a roundabout and a skull cap, and tucked his pantaloons into his boot tops like a race rider. He carried no arms. He carried nothing that was not absolutely necessary, for even the postage on his literary freight was worth $5 a letter. He got but little frivolous correspondence to carry. His bag had business letters in it mostly. His horse was stripped of all unnecessary weight, too. He wore a little wafer of a racing saddle and no visible blanket. He wore light shoes or none at all. The little flat mail pockets strapped under the rider's thighs would each hold about the bulk of a child's primer. They held many and many an important business chapter and newspaper letter, but these were written on paper as airy and thin as gold leaf nearly, and thus bulk and weight were economized. The stagecoach traveled about 100 to 125 miles a day, 24 hours. The pony rider about 250. There were about 80 pony riders in the saddle all the time, night and day, stretching in a long, scattering procession from Missouri to California, 40 flying eastward and 40 toward the west, among them making 400 gallant horses earn a stirring livelihood and see a deal of scenery every single day of the year. And then he talks about so I'm just going over the parts that I thought were really interesting. He talks about this, he was kind of a sheriff. He was like in charge of keeping security on the Overland Trail, and his name was Slade, and he was kind of, he had like a lot of tall tales about him. There was a lot of stories about him that made him seem meaner than he was, but this says, really and truly, 2/3 of the talk of drivers and conductors had been about this man Slade, ever since the day before we reached Julesburg. In order that the Eastern reader may have a clear conception of what a Rocky Mountain desperado is, in his highest state of development, I will reduce all this mass of overland gossip to one straightforward narrative, and present it in the following shape. Slade was born in Illinois, of good parentage. At about 26 years of age, he killed a man in a quarrel and fled the country. At St. Joseph, Missouri, he joined one of the early California-bound immigrant trains and was given the post of train master. One day on the plains, he had an angry dispute with one of his wagon drivers, and both drew their revolvers, but the driver was the quicker artist and had his weapon cocked first. So Slade said it was a pity to waste life on so small a matter, and proposed that the pistols be thrown on the ground and the quarrel settled by a fist fight. The unsuspecting driver agreed and threw down his pistol, whereupon Slade laughed at his simplicity and shot him dead. He made his escape and lived a wild life for a while, dividing his time between fighting Indians and avoiding an Illinois sheriff who had been sent to arrest him for his first murder. It is said that in one Indian battle he killed 3 savages with his own hand, and afterwards cut their ears off and sent them, with his compliments, to the chief of the tribe. Slade soon gained a name for fearless resolution, and this was sufficient merit to procure for him the important post of Overland Division Agent at Julesburg, in place of Mr. Jules, removed. So then, like, the next couple chapters are about Slade and about all of the adventures and the things that the stories about him. And then Mark Twain actually got to meet Slade, and he says Never youth stared and shivered as I did when I heard them call him Slade. Here was a romance, and I sitting face to face with it, looking upon it and touching it, hobnobbing with it, as it were. Here, right by my side, was the actual ogre who, in fights and brawls in various ways, had taken the lives of 26 human beings, or all men lied about him. I supposed I was the proudest stripling that ever traveled to see strange lands and wonderful people. He was so friendly and so gentle-spoken that I warmed to him in spite of his awful history. It was hardly possible to realize that this pleasant person was the pitiless scourge of the outlaws, the raw head and bloody bones the nursing mothers of the mountains terrified their children with. And to this day I can remember nothing remarkable about Slade, except that his face was rather broad across the cheekbones, and that the cheekbones were low, and the lips peculiarly thin and straight. But that was enough to leave something of an effect upon me, for since I seldom see a face possessing those characteristics without fancying that the owner of it is this dangerous man. Slade was actually executed by vigilantes, and then they're still traveling west, and they get to the mountains, and I thought that his description of the mountains was really good. He says, 2 miles beyond South Pass City, we saw for the first time that mysterious marvel which all Western untraveled boys have heard of and fully believe in, but are sure to be astounded at when they see it with their own eyes. Nevertheless, banks of snow in dead summertime. We were now far up toward the sky, and knew all the time that we must presently encounter lofty summits clad in the eternal snow that was so commonplace a matter of mention in books. And yet, when I did see it, glittering in the sun on stately domes in the distance, and knew that the month was August, and that my coat was hanging up because it was too warm to wear it, I was full as much amazed as if I had never heard of snow in August before. Truly, seeing is believing, and many a man lives a long life through thinking he believes certain, universally received and well-established things, and yet never suspects that if he were confronted by those things, once he would discover that he did not really believe them before, but only thought he believed them. In a little while, quite a number of peaks swung into view, with long claws of glittering snow clasping them, and with here and there in the shade down the mountain a solitary patch of snow looking no larger than a lady's pocket handkerchief, but being in reality as large as a public square. So then they're getting to South Pass. That's a landmark on the Overland Trail. And then during this time, he sees a guy that he knew from school, and he calls him John Blank. And this is a pretty funny story. On the summit, we overtook an immigrant train of many wagons and many tired men and women, and many a disgusted sheep and cow. In the woefully dusty horseman in charge of the expedition, I recognized John Blank. Of all the persons in the world to meet on top of the Rocky Mountains, thousands of miles from home, he was the last one I should have looked for. We were schoolboys together and warm friends for years, but a boyish prank of mine had disrupted this friendship, and it had never been renewed. The act of which I speak was this. I had been accustomed to visit occasionally an editor who was in the 3rd story of a building and overlooked the street. One day this editor gave me a watermelon, which I made preparations to devour on the spot. But chancing to look out the window, I saw John standing directly under it, and an irresistible desire came upon me to drop the melon on his head, which I immediately did. I was the loser, for it spoiled the melon, and John never forgave me, and we dropped all intercourse and parted, but now met again under these circumstances. We recognized each other simultaneously, and hands were grasped as warmly as if no coldness had existed between us, and no allusion was made to any. All animosities were buried, and the simple fact of meeting a familiar face in that isolated spot so far from home was sufficient to make us forget all things but pleasant ones, and we parted again with sincere goodbyes, and God bless you from both. They're headed into Utah, and so the mountains are turning into the desert. We left the snowy Wind River Mountains and Yenta Mountains behind and sped away, always through splendid scenery, but occasionally through long ranks of white skeletons of mules and oxen, monuments of the huge immigration of the other days. And here and there were upended boards or small piles of stones, which the driver said marked the resting place of more precious remains. It was the loneliest land for a grave, a land given over to the coyote and the raven, which is but another name for desolation and utter solitude. On damp, murky nights, these scattered skeletons gave forth a soft, hideous glow, like very faint spots of moonlight starring in the vague desert. It was because of the phosphorus in the bones, but no scientific explanation could keep a body from shivering when he drifted by one of those ghostly lights and knew that a skull held it. So, next they're coming into Mormon territory in Utah. And he talks about this group of Mormons. So, this to me is the best part of the book because it's hilarious. I looked it up in the Salt Lake City archives, and it actually really did happen. Mark Twain really did meet Brigham Young, and so he talks about different groups of Mormons, but this is where he talks about this group called the Destroying Angels. Half an hour later, we changed horses and took supper with a Mormon destroying angel. Destroying angels, as I understand it, are Latter-day Saints who are set apart by the church to conduct permanent disappearances of obnoxious citizens. I had heard a deal about these Mormon destroying angels and the dark and bloody deeds they had done, and when I entered this one's house, I had my shutter all ready, but alas, for all our romances, he was nothing but a loud, profane, offensive old blackguard. He was murderous enough, possibly, to fill the bill of a destroyer, but would you have any kind of an angel devoid of dignity? Could you abide an angel in an unclean shirt and no suspenders? Could you respect an angel with a hoarse laugh and a swagger like a buccaneer? There were other blackguards present, comrades of this one, and there was one person that looked like a gentleman, Heber C. Kimball's son, tall and well-made and 30 years old, perhaps. A lot of slatternly women flitted hither and thither in a hurry with coffee pots and plates of bread and other appurtenances to supper. And these were said to be the wives of the angel, or some of them at least. And of course they were, for if they had been hired help, they would not have let the angel from above storm and swear at them as he did, let alone one from the place this one hailed from. And then next he meets Brigham Young. So then he meets Brigham Young, and this is my favorite part of the book. It is hilarious. So he meets this. So this is kind of the long and short of it. Him and his brother get a chance to meet Brigham Young, and Brigham Young does not like Mark Twain. He completely snubs him. He won't even acknowledge him. And when Mark Twain tries to ask him questions about like his approach to dealing with Congress, all this stuff, because the Mormons in Utah they did not want to become part of the United States. This was before they settled in Utah, before Utah was a state, and they did not want to be part of the federal government. They didn't want to be a state. They just wanted to be their own country, and so they did not like the federal government. and Mark Twain wanted to talk to him about it, but Brigham Young literally just wouldn't acknowledge him. And at the end of the meeting with him and his brother, because he was traveling with his brother, Brigham Young walked up to his brother and looked at him and patted Mark Twain on the head and said, "This must be your child. Is it a boy or a girl?" And that's what he did. He said that to Mark Twain. Or he said that to Mark Twain's brother. So Mark Twain was so mad that he roasted Mormons for like 4 chapters. The next 4 chapters of the book, I mean, he just, it is so bad. I mean, it's hilarious. I can't even read some of it. But here is the actual excerpt of when he met Brigham Young. The second day, we made the acquaintance of Mr. Street, since deceased, and put on white shirts and went and paid a state visit to the king. He seemed a quiet, kindly, easy-mannered, dignified, self-possessed old gentleman of 50 or 60, and had a gentle craft in his eye that probably belonged there. He was very simply dressed, and was just taking off a straw hat as we entered. He talked about Utah and the Indians, Nevada, and the general American matters and questions with our secretary and certain government officials who came with us, but he never paid any attention to me. Notwithstanding, I made several attempts to draw him out on federal politics and his high-handed attitude toward Congress. I thought some of the things I said were rather fine, but he merely looked around at me at distant intervals, somewhat as I have seen a benignant old cat look around and see which kitten was meddling with her tail. By and by I subsided into an indulgent silence, and so sat until the end, hot and flushed, and execrating him in my heart for an ignorant savage. But he was calm. His conversation with those gentlemen flowed on as sweetly and peacefully and musically as any summer brook. When the audience was ended and we were retiring from the presence, he put his hand on my head, beamed down on me in an admiring way, and said to my brother, "Ah, your child, I presume, boy or girl?" So then he is mad. He's pissed off. So they spend some more time in Utah. One of the guys with them gets drunk, and then this is the last sentence of this chapter of the one that from when he met Brigham. He says, Our stay in Salt Lake City amounted to only 2 days, and therefore we had no time to make the customary inquisition into the workings of polygamy and get up the usual statistics and deductions preparatory to calling the attention of the nation at large once more to the matter. I had the will to do it, with gushing self-sufficiency of youth. I was feverish to plunge in headlong and achieve a great reform there, until I saw the Mormon women. Then I was touched. My heart was wiser than my head. It warmed toward these poor, ungainly, and pathetically homely creatures, and as I turned to hide the generous moisture in my eyes, I said, "No. The man that marries one of them has done an act of Christian charity, which entitles him to the kindly applause of mankind, not their harsh censure, and the man that marries 60 of them has done a deed of open-handed generosity so sublime that the nations should stand uncovered in his presence and worship in silence." Yeah, so that's just the beginning. And then he tells this story about this guy who they were talking to, Mr. Johnson. And I think this was a tall tale that he made up, because later he says, I don't know if Mr. Johnson's really a believable guy. But he says, according to one of these Gentile friends of ours, Brigham Young's harem contains 20 or 30 wives. They said some of them had grown old and gone out of active service, but were comfortably housed and cared for in the hennery, or the lion house, as it is strangely named. Along with each wife were her children, 50 altogether. The house was perfectly quiet and orderly when the children were still. They all took their meals in one room, and a happy, home-like sight it was pronounced to be. None of our party got an opportunity to take dinner with Mr. Young, but a Gentile by the name of Johnson professed to have enjoyable sociable breakfast in the Lion House. He gave a preposterous account of the calling of the roll and other preliminaries and the carnage that ensued when the buckwheat cakes came in, but he embellished rather too much. He said that Mr. Young told him several smart sayings of certain of his 2-year-olds, observing with some pride that for many years he had been the heaviest contributor to that line to one of the Eastern magazines, and then he wanted to show Mr. Johnson one of the pets that had said the last good thing, but he could not find the child. He searched the faces of the children in detail, but he could not decide which one it was. Finally he gave up with a sigh and said, "I thought I would know the little cub again, but I don't." Mr. Johnson said further that Mr. Young observed that life was a sad, sad thing, because the joy of every new marriage a man contracted was so apt to be blighted by the inappropriate funeral of a less recent bride. And Mr. Johnson said that while he and Mr. Young were pleasantly conversing in private, one of the Mrs. Youngs came in and demanded a breastpin, remarking that she found out that he had been giving a breastpin to number 6, and she, for one, did not propose to let this partiality go on without making a satisfactory amount of trouble about it. Mr. Young reminded her that there was a stranger present. Mrs. Young said that if the state of things inside the house was not agreeable to the stranger, he could find room outside. Mr. Young promised the breastpin, and she went away. But in a minute or two, Mrs. Young came in and demanded a breastpin. Mr. Young began a remonstrance, but Mrs. Young cut him short. She said number 6 had gotten one and number 11 was promised one, and it was no use for him to try to impose on her. She hoped she knew her rights. He gave his promise, and she went. And presently 3 Mrs. Youngs entered in a body and opened on their husband a tempest of tears, abuse, and entreaty. They heard all about number 6, number 11, and number 14. 3 more breastpins were promised. They were hardly gone when 9 more Mrs. Youngs filed into the presence, and a new tempest burst forth and raged round about and the prophet and his guest. 9 breastpins were promised, and the weird sisters filed out again. And in came 11 more, weeping and wailing and gnashing their teeth. 11 promised breastpins purchased peace once more. "That is a specimen," said Mr. Young. "You see how it is? You see what a life I lead? A man can't be wise all the time. In a heedless moment I gave my darling number 6, excuse me by calling her thus, as her other name has escaped me for the moment, a breastpin. It was only worth $25. That is, apparently that was its whole cost, but its ultimate cost was inevitably bound to be a good deal more. You yourself have seen it climb up to $650, and alas, even that is not the end, for I have wives all over this territory of Utah. I have dozens of wives, whose numbers even I do not know without looking in the family Bible. They are scattered far and wide among the mountains and the valleys of my realm, and mark you, every solitary one of them will hear of this wretched breastpin, and every last one of them will have one or die. Number 6's breastpin will cost me $2,500 before I see the end of it, and these creatures will compare these pins together, and if one is a shade finer than the rest, they will all be thrown on my hands, and I will have to order a new lot to keep peace in the family. Sir, you probably did not know it, but all the time you were present with my children, your every movement was watched by vigilant servitors of mine. If you had offered to give a child a dime or a stick of candy or a trifle of any kind, you would have been snatched out of the house instantly, provided it could be done before your gift left her hand. Otherwise, it would be absolutely necessary for you to make an exactly similar gift to all of my children. And knowing by experience the importance of the thing, I would have stood by and seen to it myself that you did it, and did it thoroughly. Once a gentleman gave one of my children a tin whistle, a veritable invention of Satan, sir, and one which I have an unspeakable horror of. And so would you, if you had 80 or 90 children in your house. But the deed was done. The man escaped. I knew that the result was going to be, and I thirsted for vengeance. I ordered out a flock of destroying angels, and they hunted the man far into fastness of the Nevada mountains, but they never caught him. I am not cruel, sir. I am not vindictive, except when sorely outraged. But if I had caught him, sir, so help me Joseph Smith, I would have locked him into the nursery till the brats whistled him to death. By the slaughtered body of St. Parley Pratt, whom God assoil, there was never anything on this earth like it. I knew who gave the whistle to the child, but I could not make these jealous mothers believe me. They believed I did it. And the result was just what any man of reflection could have foreseen. I had to order 110 whistles. I think we had 110 children in the house then, but some of them are off at college now. I had to order 110 of those shrieking things, and I wish I may never speak another word if we didn't have to talk on our fingers entirely from that time forth until the children got tired of the whistles. And if ever another man gives a whistle to a child of mine, and I get my hands on him, I will hang him higher than Haman. That is the word with bark on it. Shade of Nephi. You don't know anything about married life. I am rich and everybody knows it. I am benevolent and everybody takes advantage of it. I have a strong fatherly instinct and all the foundlings are foisted on me. Every time a woman wants to do well by her darling, she puzzles her brain to cipher out some scheme for getting it into my hands. Anyway, the next chapter, he actually goes into the Book of Mormon and picks it apart, and I don't have anything against the Mormon religion or anything like that, but it's bad. It's real bad. So, that was pretty funny. And then they traveled west, and they ended up in Carson City. And in Carson City, they were staying in a lodge house with an Irish brigade of 4 or 5 Irishmen who were workers, and they would go and do work on the railroad and do like different jobs for the lodger. And this is hilarious. They collected tarantulas because in Carson City it was pretty much desert. And it says the surveyors brought back more tarantulas with them, so we had quite a menagerie arranged along the shelves of the room. Some of these spiders could straddle over a common saucer with their hairy, muscular legs, and when their feelings were hurt or their dignity offended, they were the wickedest-looking desperadoes the animal world can furnish. If their glass prison houses were touched ever so lightly, they were up and spoiling for a fight like a minute. Starchy, proud, indeed. They would take up straw and pick their teeth like a member of Congress. There was, as usual, a furious zephyr blowing the first night of the brigade's return, and about midnight the roof of an adjoining stable blew off, and a corner of it came crashing through the side of our ranch. There was a simultaneous awakening and a tumultuous muster of the brigade in the dark, and a general tumbling and sprawling over each other in the narrow aisle between the beds. In the midst of the turmoil, Bob H. sprung up out of a sound sleep and knocked down a shelf with his head. Instantly, he shouted, "Turn out, boys! The tarantulas is loose!" No warning ever sounded so dreadful. Nobody tried any longer to leave the room, lest he might step on a tarantula. Every man groped for a trunk or a bed and jumped on it. Then followed the strangest silence, a silence of grisly suspense it was, too. Waiting expectancy, fear. It was as dark as pitch, and one had to imagine the spectacle of those 14 scant-clad men roosting gingerly onto trunks and beds, for not a thing could be seen. Then came occasional little interruptions of the silence, and one could recognize a man and tell his locality by his voice, or locate any other sound a sufferer made by his gropings or changes of position. The occasional voices were not given to much speaking. You simply heard a gentle ejaculation of "ow!" followed by a solid thump, and you knew the gentleman had felt a hairy blanket or something touch his bare skin, and had skipped from a bed to the floor. Another silence. Presently you would hear a gasping voice say, "Something's crawling up the back of my neck." Every now and then you could hear a little subdued scramble and a sorrowful, "Oh, Lord." And then you knew that somebody was getting away from something he took for a tarantula, and not losing any time about it either. Directly a voice in the corner rang out wild and clear. "I've got him! I've got him!" Pause and a probable change of circumstances. "No, he's got me! Oh, ain't they never gonna fetch a lantern?" The lantern came at that moment in the hands of Mrs. O'Flanagan, whose anxiety to know the amount of damage done by the assaulting roof had not prevented her waiting a judicious interval after getting out of bed and lighting up to see if the wind was done. Now upstairs or had a larger contract. The landscape presented when the lantern was flashed into the room was picturesque, and might have been funny to some people, but it was not to us. Although we were perched so strangely upon boxes and trunks and beds, so strangely attired too, we were too earnestly distressed and too genuinely miserable to see any fun about it, and there was not the semblance of a smile anywhere visible. I know I am not capable of suffering more than I did during those few minutes of suspense in the dark, surrounded by those creeping, bloody-minded tarantulas. I had skipped from bed to bed, from box to box in a cold agony, and every time I touched anything that was furzy, I fancied I felt the fangs. I would rather go to war than live that episode over again. Nobody was hurt. The man who thought a tarantula had got him was mistaken. Only a crack in the box had caught his finger. Not one of those escaped tarantulas was ever seen again. There were 10 or 12 of them. We took candles and hunted the place high and low for them, but with no success. Did we go back to bed then? We did nothing of the kind. Money could not persuade us to do it. We sat up the rest of the night playing cribbage and keeping a sharp lookout for the enemy. So then they go west and they go to somewhere around Carson City where they start mining. They hire an old man, a blacksmith 60 years of age, 2 young lawyers, and him decided to get a wagon and some horses and head to go mine for silver. And the horses that they bought, they ended up having to get out and push the wagon, and I thought it was funny, his description of the old man that they hired. He was an old miner, but he said, "Parties who met us occasionally advised us to put the horses in the wagon, but Mr. Ballou, through whose ironclad earnestness no sarcasm could pierce, said that would not do, because the provisions were exposed and would suffer, the horses being bituminous from long deprivation." The reader will excuse me from translating what Mr. Ballou customarily meant when he used a long word was a secret between himself and his Maker. He was one of the best and kindest-hearted men that ever graced a humble sphere of life. He was gentleness and simplicity itself, and unselfishness too. Although he was more than twice as old as the eldest of us, he never gave himself any airs, privileges, or exemptions on that account. He did a young man's share of the work, and did his share of conversing and entertaining from the general standpoint of any age, not from the arrogant, overawing summit height of 60 years old. His one striking peculiarity was his Partington fashion of loving and using big words for their own sakes, and independent of any bearing they might have upon the thought he was purposing to convey. He always let his ponderous syllables fall with an easy unconsciousness that left them wholly without offensiveness. In truth, his air was so natural and so simple that one was always catching himself accepting his stately sentences as meaning something when they really meant nothing in the world. If a word was long and grand and resonant, it was sufficient to win the old man's love, and he would drop that word into the most out-of-the-way place in a sentence or a subject, and be as pleased with it as if it were perfectly luminous with meaning. This is funny. It talks about when they camped 2 days in the neighborhood of the sink of the Humboldt. The water there was very alkaline. The water left a burning taste in the mouth, bitter and every way execrable, and a burning in the stomach that was very uncomfortable. We put molasses in it, but it helped very little. We added a pickle, yet the alkali was the prominent taste, and it was unfit for drinking. The coffee we made of this water was the meanest compound man has yet invented. It was really viler to the taste than the unameliorated water itself. Mr. Ballou, being the architect and builder of the beverage, felt constrained to endorse and uphold it, and so drank half a cup, by little sips, making shift to praise it faintly the while, but finally threw out the remainder and said frankly it was too technical for him. I like Mr. Ballou. He's probably my favorite character in the book. I want to be like that. So then they kept traveling west, and they ended up finding a couple. They were looking for silver, and Mark Twain found some. He went out by himself one day, and he thought he found gold, and he got a whole bunch of it out of the river, and it was fool's gold, and he showed it to Mr. Ballou, and Mr. Ballou told him it was fool's gold. But I mean, this much of the book, this much right here, is mining. And it is, to me, was really boring. But I think I might try to reread it one day and find the nuggets in it, but nothing really stood out to me. I mean, there was some good stuff in there, but to me, the most interesting parts of the book were the Pony Express rider, the Overland Trail driver, Sage, and then he goes. So after they finish mining, they go to California, and end up in San Francisco, and Mark Twain gets a job as an editor, and he actually gets fired from the job, and ends up on a ship to Hawaii, which was, at that time, it wasn't called Hawaii, it was called the Sandwich Islands. And they spent a lot of time in Hawaii and had a lot of adventures there. But I thought it was interesting when they're actually getting to Hawaii on the ship. On a certain bright morning, the islands hove in sight, lying low on the lonely sea, and everybody climbed to the upper deck to look. After 2,000 miles of watery solitude, the vision was a welcome one. As we approached, the imposing promontory of Diamond Head rose up and out of the ocean, its rugged front softened by the hazy distance, and presently the details of the land began to make themselves manifest. First the line of the beach, and then the plumed coconut trees of the tropics, then the cabins of the natives, and then the white town of Honolulu, said to contain between 12 and 15,000 inhabitants, spread over a dead level with streets from 20 to 30 feet wide, solid and level as the floor, most of them as straight as the line and few as crooked as a corkscrew. So then they get there, and says there's a lot of cats there. Thought it was interesting when he first sees surfers. So this was before California dude surfing. The Hawaiian guys were surf bathing. That's what they called it. In one place we came upon a large company of naked natives of both sexes and all ages amusing themselves with the national pastime of surf bathing. Each would take a paddle 300 or 400 yards out to sea, taking a short board with them. Then face the shore and wait for a particularly prodigious billow to come along. At the right moment he would fling his board upon its foamy crest, and himself upon the board, and here he would come whizzing by like a bombshell. It did not seem that a lightning express train could shoot along at a more hair-lifting speed. I tried surf bathing once, subsequently, but made a failure of it. I got the board placed right, and then at the right moment too, but missed the connection myself. The board struck the shore in 3/4 of a second without any cargo, and I struck the bottom about the same time with a couple of barrels of water in me. None but the natives ever mastered the art of bathing thoroughly. So they he ends up going back to California, and then he gets tired and decides to go back to he takes a ship back to New York. So he says, I took a berth in the steamship, bade goodbye to the friendliest land and the liveliest, which was San Francisco, the hardiest community on our continent, and came by way of the Isthmus to New York, a trip that was not much of a picnic excursion, for the cholera broke out among us on every passage, and we buried 2 or 3 bodies at sea every day. I found home a dreary place after my long absence, for half the children I had known were now wearing whiskers or waterfalls, and a few of them grown people I had been acquainted with remained at their hearthstones prosperous and happy. Some of them had wandered to other scenes, some were in jail, and the rest had been hanged. These changes touched me deeply, and I went away and joined the famous Quaker City European excursion and carried my fears into foreign land. Thus, after 7 years of vicissitudes, ended a pleasure trip to the silver mines of Nevada, which had originally been intended to occupy only 3 months. However, I usually miss my calculations further than that. Oh, and I also forgot, him and his brother went to Lake Tahoe in Nevada. They loved it. They stayed there for a long time. I think they bought a cabin there, but they would sleep on the river on the lake bank, and it was the most beautiful thing. They would always go out in their boat, and they just wasted the days away. But what ended up happening was their cabin burned down, and they had to leave. But the moral of the book, it says, if the reader thinks he's done now, and that this book has no moral to it, he is in error. The moral of it is this: if you are of any account, stay at home, and make your way by faithful diligence. But if you are no account, go away from home, and then you will have to work, whether you want to or not. Thus, you become a blessing to your friends by ceasing to be a nuisance to them, if the people you go among suffer by the operation. So, after that, there's some appendices where he talks more about the Mormon Church and Brigham Young, and then he talks about this time he got mugged in San Francisco, and so that was the end of the book. I thought it was a good read, and I enjoyed it. And thank you for your time in watching this, and